When Kyle saw me this morning, he mentioned that he had looked at the sermon title and asked if I would be singing Led Zeppelin today. I said no, but I was hoping the bell choir might perform it. But no Led Zeppelin. So Matthew here, barely 2 chapters into his gospel at this point, presents us with a very Old Testament sounding event. Because one of the common complaints, one of the common differences people cite between Old and New Testament is that New Testament tends to be, focused on Jesus and it's focused on hope and redemption and all of that stuff. And the Old Testament is blood and gore and all of that stuff. And here we have some very Old Testament things happening. At the heart of the story is Herod the Great, who is the tragically flawed client king of Judea. He's king, he rules over Judea, but he does it at the behest of the Romans. And he never forgets that. He's always trying to prove who's in charge. Herod, in some ways, when you look at the things that he did, the buildings that he created, the cities that he built, you might think that he was a civil engineer at heart. But then when you look at the other things that he does, and you realize that he had the moral sense of a rabid dog. If he was a civil engineer at heart, he would have been the kind of civil engineer that enjoyed designing gas chambers and crematoria in Nazi Germany. So after the wise men inform him that a king has been born, right here in his own backyard, and then the wise men double-cross him by not coming back and reporting to him where this king is, he flies into a rage. And Matthew tells us that when that happens, Herod immediately jumps to the logical conclusion, the next logical step. Well, it's logical if you're a psychopathic murderer who will stop at nothing to hold on to power anyway. Herod orders his soldiers to find and kill every toddler and baby boy under the age of 2 in Bethlehem. And that single horrific act is probably what most people remember most about King Herod. And it's an act that has been commemorated over centuries as the massacre of the innocents, or the slaughter of the innocents, or something similar to that. And it is a mind-numbing, brutal event. How brutal was it? Early church authorities vary in their estimates of the blood on Herod's hands in this particular incident. The Byzantine church pegged the number of innocent dead at 16,000. The Syriac church calculated the total to be more like 64,000. And the Coptic church placed the number of dead at a heart-wrenching 144,000. At which point, modern scholars just have to kind of, they raise their hands and they say, let's be real here. If Herod actually did order the death of 16,000 or 64,000 or 144,000 children, why is there no other source in history that mentions it other than this single Gospel of Matthew? If Herod really did that, if he really killed all those children, why isn't there some other contemporary record of it? And that's not an unreasonable question, because that level of wholesale murder is going to attract attention. Somebody's going to write about it. And the absence of reporting then leads some scholars, but not all, to just dismiss Matthew out of hand. They look at this and they say, that's just another folk tale. It's another myth told about Herod. The massacre of the innocents is just another story about Herod as a bogeyman to make what happened with Jesus look even more miraculous. And for a time in modern biblical scholarship, at least among the more secular scholars of Scripture, that was kind of the standard line of thought. Well, it's a really interesting story, but it didn't happen. But then other scholars, who were not quite so willing to just dismiss Matthew out of hand, decided to look at this in context. And to do that, they started by looking at what the population of Bethlehem probably was during that time. And when they did that, they realized that the story may not have been wrong, but the scale might have been overstated. And the scale is something that other people assigned to it in later years. Matthew never said there were 16,000 or 64,000 or 144,000 people killed. He just said, this is what Herod did. Others then assigned numbers to it. So what scholars found is that based on what they guessed the population of Bethlehem would have been, the number of murdered children was probably closer to 12 on the high side. It's not in the thousands or the tens of thousands, but it was still pretty barbaric, of course. But something like that, the murder of a dozen children, is much more likely to have happened under the radar of contemporary writers. Because in those times, that was nothing that horrendous. Remember who you're talking about. You're talking about King Herod. This was a man who personally had at least one wife and 3 sons killed, more or less on a whim. King Herod was the man who, as he got older and nearer to death, was concerned that people would not mourn his passing. So he came up with a simple plan to make all of Judea mourn his death. He did this by rounding up the eldest man in every family in Judea, gathering them in one place so that they could be executed when he died. And that way, he said, we will be sure that there are tears shed in Judea. So to a psychopath like that, we look at the murder of the innocents as an atrocity. He looks at it as, Thursday. That's what I do. So it's not hard at all to believe that in the circumstances as Matthew recorded him, this thing very well may have happened. Herod may very well have threatened Jesus' life, and the only way to make sure that Jesus would survive to go on to do the things he needed to do would be for his parents to take him away. To take him somewhere into some territory where the tentacles of Herod didn't reach. And that would be Egypt. And as luck would have it, it was a journey that would be financed by the gold, frankincense, and myrrh that the wise men brought. Ironically, it's the same wise men who triggered the threat, so there's a bit of irony there. So there in Egypt, Joseph and Mary would wait with Jesus until it was safe for them to return. Now at this point, as happens so often in Scripture, we have a choice of rabbit holes to go down. For instance, this part, at least, of the Gospel of Matthew bears bears a very strong echo of the story of Moses and the Exodus. Herod stands in for Pharaoh, massacring innocent children to preserve power. Jesus stands in for Moses, who was saved by miraculous intervention. You look down the line a little, and Jesus going into the wilderness before he begins his ministry mirrors Moses fleeing Egypt and going into the wilderness before he is called by God to go back and bring people out of Egypt. And ultimately, of course, we have Jesus leading us out of bondage to sin and death, while Moses led the tribes of Israel out of bondage to Pharaoh. So that's one possibility. There's been a lot written about that. Another interesting thing to look at is how the Gospel of Matthew seems to be written so that he can have things in multiple ways. Because he has Jesus born in Bethlehem, the city of David, to satisfy prophecy. Then he has Jesus move to Egypt, so that he could be called out of Egypt by the Lord. And that satisfies another prophecy. And then according to Matthew, Jesus is raised in Nazareth, which satisfies still another prophecy. And that's also interesting, and there's been a lot written about that. And these are all things that we could pursue and that we could learn from. But not to take up too much time today. I want to look at something else. Something that struck me this week as I was preparing. I want to look at how and what we can learn from Jesus' journey in itself. I want to try to guess what Jesus would want us to take away from it. And I'm going to tell you at the outset, what we're talking about might make us a little uncomfortable. But sometimes Jesus did that. Sometimes the things Jesus called us to do, or the things that he calls us to believe, or the ways in which Jesus challenges us to act, are not calculated to comfort us. They are calculated to point us toward the kingdom of heaven and how we should behave as followers of Christ. So to touch on this, I'm going to flip ahead a little bit, quite a bit in Matthew. And stay in Matthew. If you look at chapter 25, that's toward the end of Jesus' ministry, and he's talking about things that are going to happen surrounding his return. In chapter 25, verse 35, he's talking about judging. He's talking about separating the sheep from the goats. And he makes this statement that will sound familiar. He says, "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." And that last bit of the verse is what I think applies to Jesus' journey to Egypt. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Because the question that comes from that is, how good a job are we doing today of welcoming strangers? Not not just strangers that we encounter every day, strangers that come to our church. I think we do pretty well at welcoming them. I'm thinking a little broader than that. As a nation, how are we at welcoming strangers? How are we at welcoming immigrants? That's a challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge because there are very real questions, very real issues that have to be considered. Issues of security, issues of cost, issues of justice and equity. Now, I'm not a bright guy. I'm not smart. Rachel will attest to that. She tells me that all the time. You're not as smart as you think you are. But I'm smart enough to know that the answers to these questions, the resolutions to these issues, is not simple. And yet, the bottom line of what we should be doing is right there in what Jesus said. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. How well are we doing that? Now, I've got to believe that not only, at this point in his ministry, not only was Jesus echoing 1,000 years of tradition and instruction in the faith of his fathers, which he was doing, because there are multiple places in the Old Testament where the children of Israel are reminded of their duty to be welcoming to strangers and aliens among them. Jesus wasn't just doing that, but I think he was channeling and echoing his own family's experience as refugees, his own experience as a stranger in a strange land. Jesus was remembering the feeling of being alien, not part of the culture he found himself in, and what that felt like. Most of us cannot even come close to imagining that feeling. Not really, I don't think. Even if at some point in our lives we pulled up our roots and we moved to a strange place, unless that place speaks a language that we don't understand and has customs that we've never encountered, we can't truly appreciate what it's like to be aliens there. We can't understand what it feels like to be an immigrant, let alone a refugee who's fled with basically nothing. Now, I'm a provincial person. I remember 20 years ago when we went to Russia. We went there to bring Andrew home. And even just a week of being somewhere where we were surrounded by people who didn't speak English, which of course was normal there. We were the outsiders. With only a couple of people that did speak English, with customs that we weren't familiar with. Even after less than a week of that, it just felt totally lost. And when we got back to Moscow and we got into our hotel, which was a more modern one and it was more for tourists, first of all, there was a TV in the room. Rachel went and hugged it. And then we turned the TV on. First thing I found was something that looked very much like Sesame Street, except in Russian. Which was, sometimes you have to see that, if you haven't. But then we discovered the BBC News channel. People speaking English to us. And I remember that it was an island of relief. As I said, we weren't there that long. don't know the answers. I'm not sure anybody does have the answers to questions of immigration. But I do know that in Jesus' name, we ought to be trying to figure it out. And by figure it out, I mean not just standing here yelling at one another about how wrong you are. We need to be talking about it. And when I say talking about it, I don't mean saying this is what I think and then putting our fingers in our ears so we don't hear anybody else. We need to listen, we need to engage in discussion, and we need to work with one another. And this is as political as I'm going to get. We need to be looking at finding leaders who actually help resolve the issues. From whatever spectrum you're on, politically. And not because it's a human right, not because it's good or bad for our economy, not because it's part of our party platform, but we need to resolve this because it's what Jesus told us to do 2,000 years ago, and he hasn't come back to cancel that yet. I believe it's one of those uncomfortable things that we're called to do as followers of Jesus. It's up to us when we encounter guests in our country, when we encounter strangers, when we find ourselves in the presence of neighbors we haven't met yet. It is up to us to treat them with dignity and respect and grace, and to call upon others to do the same. Jesus knew what it was to be a stranger. He knew what it was to be a refugee. And that, I think, was part of what he was remembering when he said that we should welcome a stranger. It's not politics. It's right and wrong. And it's what we're called to do as God's children.